Have you ever had someone steal your work and still had to smile about it? I did, but instead of swallowing my anger, I prepared something that would make my boss sit in stunned silence when he reached the final sentence. And that was the moment everything changed forever. The envelope I handed him at the company gala wasn't just my resignation. It was the beginning of their complete collapse, because what they didn't know was that I'd been planning this for months, and I was about to pull the foundation out from under everything they thought they owned. The crystal chandeliers of the Meridian Ballroom cast amber light across polished marble floors as I adjusted my black evening dress and forced another smile at the pharmaceutical CEO standing before me. Hannah Mitchell, Strategic Analysis Director at Lockridge Partners. They'd introduced me, though tonight those titles felt like borrowed clothes that no longer fit. Your predictive models for market penetration are fascinating, Dr. Reeves was saying, his champagne glass catching the light. The accuracy rates your team achieved last quarter were unprecedented in our industry. My team, my models. I nodded graciously, the practiced corporate smile never wavering. Thank you. Data-driven strategy has always been my passion. The soft buzz of my phone against my clutch interrupted us. A text from Bradley Quinn, my direct supervisor. The timestamp read 9:47 p.m. Even by corporate standards, messaging during the company's biggest networking event of the year seemed excessive. Excuse me one moment, I murmured to Dr. Reeves, stepping toward the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline. The message was brief, brutal in its casualness. Congratulations, Hannah. We've decided to promote Ellie. She knows how to work better with the team. I stared at the screen, watching the words blur slightly as my champagne glass trembled in my other hand. 8 years of 60-hour weeks, of saving failing client relationships, of building the predictive analysis framework that had become the backbone of every major decision at Lockridge Partners. 8 years of watching Ellie Harrington coast on charm and stolen insights while I delivered actual results. She knows how to work better with the team. The euphemism was almost insulting in its transparency. Translation: Ellie made people comfortable. She laughed at the right jokes, remembered birthdays, and never challenged anyone's ideas, especially not when those ideas were wrong. I lifted my gaze from the phone to find Bradley across the room, standing near the bar with a cluster of senior partners. He was watching me with that self-satisfied expression I'd grown to despise. The look of a man who believed he'd just delivered necessary medicine to a child who wouldn't understand it was for her own good. Our eyes met across the crowded ballroom. He raised his glass slightly, a mock toast to the decision he'd just delivered via text message. The old Hannah might have excused herself to the bathroom, might have spent 20 minutes composing a careful response about being disappointed but understanding the company's decision. The old Hannah might have spent the rest of the evening networking with forced enthusiasm, pretending her career hadn't just been kneecapped by a man who couldn't read a profit-loss statement without help. But I wasn't the old Hannah anymore. I hadn't been for months. I slipped my phone back into my clutch and reached for the cream-colored envelope I'd been carrying all evening. The paper was expensive, heavy stock, the kind reserved for important announcements. Inside, 2 documents waited. One that would surprise him, and one that would destroy everything he thought he knew about how this company actually functioned. Dr. Reeves, I said, returning to the pharmaceutical CEO with renewed focus. I apologize for the interruption. As I was saying, predictive modeling is indeed my specialty. In fact, I've recently developed some breakthrough applications that might interest you. We spoke for another 10 minutes about market analysis and strategic forecasting. I handed him my card, not the Lockridge Partners card, but the new one I'd had printed last week. He studied it with interest before tucking it into his jacket pocket. I'll have my team reach out next week, he said. This could be exactly what we need for our expansion into emerging markets. After he moved on to mingle with other guests, I made my way across the ballroom. The crowd seemed to part naturally, or perhaps I was simply moving with more purpose than I had in years. Bradley was still holding court near the bar, gesturing animatedly as he told some story about a client victory. A victory that had been built on my analysis, my late nights, my relentless attention to detail. Bradley, I said, approaching the group with the same calm smile I'd worn all evening. Hannah. His voice carried that forced joviality people use when they've just delivered bad news and want to pretend everything is fine. Enjoying the gala? Immensely. I held out the envelope. I have something for you. He accepted it with curiosity, turning it over in his hands. The senior partners around us continued their conversation about quarterly projections, but I could sense their peripheral attention. What's this? Bradley asked. Open it, I said simply. He broke the seal and pulled out the first document. I watched his face change as he read. Confusion, then alarm, then something approaching panic. Hannah, we should discuss this privately. No need, I interrupted, my voice carrying clearly in the space between us. Everything important has already been said. I turned to leave, then paused and looked back at him. Oh, and Bradley? You'll want to read all the way to the last sentence. That's where it gets interesting. The envelope contained my resignation letter, effective immediately. But more importantly, it contained the intellectual property withdrawal notice I'd had my lawyer prepare months ago. Every predictive model, every analysis framework, every piece of strategic methodology that had made Lockridge Partners a leader in business consulting, all of it was mine. Developed on my own time, using my own resources, with my own proprietary algorithms. They'd never bothered to make me sign an IP agreement because they'd never imagined I was capable of creating something they couldn't control. Tomorrow morning, while Ellie was settling into her new promotion, Lockridge Partners would discover that their entire competitive advantage had just walked out the door in a black evening dress. I joined Lockridge Partners at 28, fresh from the wreckage of a tech startup that had burned through venture capital faster than a wildfire through dry grass. The company had been my attempt at entrepreneurial glory, a data analytics platform for small businesses that died when our lead developer disappeared with half the code and our biggest investor pulled out overnight. I'd lost my savings, my confidence, and my naive belief that good ideas automatically translated to business success. Lockridge Partners represented everything I thought I wanted then: stability, structure, a chance to rebuild without the constant terror of making payroll. The corporate headquarters in downtown Philadelphia felt like a fortress after months of working from coffee shops and co-working spaces. Bradley Quinn, then a senior director, had interviewed me with the kind of paternalistic concern that should have been my first red flag. You've got impressive technical skills, he'd said, reviewing my portfolio. But you'll need to learn how business really works here. It's not just about being right, it's about being right in a way that doesn't make people uncomfortable. I'd nodded eagerly, grateful for any opportunity to prove myself again. How desperate I must have seemed. How perfectly malleable for their purposes. The first 2 years were a blur of 60-hour weeks and small victories. I rebuilt their entire client assessment process, introducing predictive modeling that identified potential contract failures months before they happened. The old system had been little more than educated guesswork wrapped in consulting jargon. My approach used machine learning algorithms to analyze client communication patterns, payment histories, and market volatility indicators. The results were undeniable. Client retention improved by 37%. Revenue from existing contracts increased by 22% because we could identify expansion opportunities before competitors even knew they existed. I'd essentially created a crystal ball for business development, and the partners began treating me like their secret weapon. But secret weapons, I learned, are meant to be hidden. While I was buried in spreadsheets and algorithm development, Ellie Harrington was building relationships. She joined the company 6 months after me, hired as a junior consultant with an MBA from a second-tier school and exactly zero experience in data analysis. What she lacked in technical ability, she made up for in an almost supernatural ability to make people feel important. Ellie remembered everyone's coffee orders. She organized birthday celebrations and retirement parties. She had a gift for asking just the right questions during meetings, questions that made senior partners feel wise and insightful, even when they were suggesting strategies that would have been outdated in 1995. More importantly, she had a gift for presenting my work as collaborative insights. Hannah's analysis suggests we might want to consider, she'd begin, then seamlessly transition into explanations that made complex data sound like common sense. The partners would nod approvingly, grateful for her translation of my incomprehensible technical jargon into business language they could understand. I should have been angry. Instead, I was grateful. Ellie was helping me communicate better. I told myself, she was teaching me how to connect with people, how to make my work more accessible. The fact that she was steadily building a reputation as an insightful strategist while I remained the technical support didn't seem important, as long as the work was getting done. By my 5th year, I'd developed what became known internally as the Lockridge Advantage, a comprehensive predictive framework that could assess everything from market entry strategies to merger probabilities. The system had saved clients millions in avoided bad investments and generated even more in identified opportunities. But when the industry trade publications wrote about Lockridge's innovative approach to strategic consulting, they quoted Bradley and the senior partners. When competitors tried to poach our talent, they went after Ellie and her supposed gift for market intuition. "You're too technical," Bradley explained during one of our annual reviews. "Clients want to feel like they're working with advisors, not data scientists. Ellie has that natural consulting instinct. But the data is important. Hannah, don't misunderstand me. But people buy from people they like. Ellie makes them feel heard." I stared at him across his mahogany desk, watching him sip coffee from a mug that read, "World's Best Boss." A gift from Ellie, no doubt. "So what you're saying is that my work is valuable, but I'm not." "That's not what I'm saying at all." His tone carried the patient condescension of someone explaining basic math to a child. "I'm saying that your skills are most valuable when they're channeled through someone who understands the human element of business." The human element, as if I were some kind of analytical robot incapable of normal social interaction. As if the late nights I'd spent on client calls, talking executives through crisis situations, meant nothing. As if the thank you notes I'd received from CEOs whose companies I'd helped save were just polite formalities. But I'd learned to swallow my frustration, to channel it into better work. I developed new models, refined existing algorithms, and built systems that could predict market shifts with startling accuracy. Each success was presented to clients as another example of Lockridge's collaborative approach to strategic consulting. Last year, when the partners decided to create a new senior strategic advisor position, I'd been certain it was mine. My work had generated over $15 million in new revenue. I'd single-handedly prevented 3 major client defections by identifying problems before they escalated. My predictive models had become the foundation for every major strategic decision the company made. The position went to Ellie. "She's ready for the next level," Bradley had explained. "She's learned to synthesize complex information and present it in ways that resonate with C-suite executives." Synthesize, such a clean word for theft. That night, sitting in my apartment with a bottle of wine and a laptop full of code that had made other people rich, I'd realized something important. I'd been playing by their rules in a game where the rules were designed to ensure I could never win. So I'd stopped playing their game entirely. The revelation had come gradually, like watching sunrise creep across a landscape you'd been navigating in darkness for years. I didn't wake up one morning and decide to build an escape route. It evolved from a growing certainty that I'd outgrown everything Lockridge Partners could offer me, and they'd made it clear I'd never be allowed to grow within their walls. It started with weekend projects. Small consulting gigs that friends from my startup days would send my way. Nothing that competed with Lockridge's client base. Just favor-driven analysis for companies too small to afford our minimum engagement fees. A restaurant chain wanting to predict seasonal demand fluctuations. A regional bank needing risk assessment for their commercial lending portfolio. Problems that required exactly the kind of predictive modeling I'd been perfecting for years. The work was satisfying in a way my day job had stopped being. These clients didn't need my insights filtered through Ellie's charm or Bradley's executive translation. They wanted results, and they understood that good data analysis was worth paying for. More importantly, They credited me directly for the value I provided. By month 3 of my side work, I'd identified a pattern. Every small business I consulted for struggled with the same fundamental challenge: resource allocation. They knew they needed to hire, expand, or invest, but they couldn't predict which decisions would generate sustainable growth versus expensive mistakes. They needed what I'd begun calling integrated strategic projection, a way to model how personnel decisions, market timing, and resource allocation would interact across multiple business cycles. The existing software solutions were either too expensive for smaller companies or too generic to provide actionable insights. What they needed was something that could adapt to their specific industry, scale, and growth stage. A consultative tool that could learn from their data and provide increasingly accurate predictions over time. I called it Integra Pro. The development happened in stolen hours, early mornings before work, late nights after Lockridge meetings, entire weekends when I told myself I was just exploring interesting technical problems. The core algorithm drew from everything I'd learned, building predictive models for Fortune 500 companies, but scaled and adapted for businesses with limited data infrastructure. The breakthrough came when I realized that most small to medium businesses face surprisingly similar decision trees, regardless of their industry. The variables might be different: a manufacturing company worried about supply chain disruptions while a service business focused on talent retention. But the underlying mathematical relationships were consistent. I could build a framework that would learn from each client's data while improving its predictions for all future clients. 6 months into development, I had a working prototype. 8 months in, I'd refined it into something that consistently outperformed existing solutions. By month 10, I was ready to test it with real clients. The first pilot was with Rodriguez Manufacturing, a mid-sized automotive parts supplier that had been struggling with inventory management. Within 3 weeks, Integra Pro had identified $2.3 million in potential savings through optimized purchasing cycles and workforce planning. The owner, Maria Rodriguez, was so impressed that she introduced me to her network of similar businesses. Word spread quickly in the kind of tight-knit industrial community where reputation was everything. I started getting inquiries from companies I'd never heard of, all facing variations of the same resource allocation challenges. Each implementation taught me something new about the system's capabilities and limitations. But the real validation came when I started receiving calls from larger firms, mid-market companies that were too sophisticated for generic solutions but too cost-conscious for traditional consulting engagements. They wanted exactly what I'd built: high-level strategic analysis with the precision of advanced data modeling, delivered through software that could evolve with their needs. By month 12, I had a client roster generating more monthly revenue than my Lockridge salary. More importantly, I had something that belonged entirely to me. Every line of code, every algorithm, every innovative approach to predictive modeling, it was mine. I developed it using my own equipment, my own time, my own insights. I'd never signed any intellectual property agreements with Lockridge because they'd never imagined I was capable of creating something they couldn't control. The irony was perfect. While they were promoting Ellie for her ability to repackage my work for client consumption, I was building something that would make their entire business model obsolete. The phone call from Vanguard Insights came on a Tuesday morning in March. Dr. Sarah Kim, their chief technology officer, had heard about Integra Pro through a mutual contact and wanted to discuss potential partnership opportunities. "We're looking for someone who can help us bridge the gap between enterprise-level analytics and practical business application," she explained during our first video call. "Your work with predictive resource allocation is exactly what we need to complete our strategic consulting platform." Vanguard was everything Lockridge pretended to be: innovative, data-driven, and genuinely interested in solving complex business problems rather than just maintaining comfortable client relationships. They'd been founded by former McKinsey consultants who'd grown frustrated with the industry's resistance to technological advancement. "We're not looking to acquire your software," Dr. Kim had clarified. "We're looking to acquire you. We want you to lead our strategic analysis division and help us build the next generation of business consulting tools." The offer was extraordinary. Not just the salary, though that was nearly double what I made at Lockridge, but the opportunity to work with people who understood the value of what I'd built. They wanted to scale Integra Pro into something that could serve Fortune 500 clients while maintaining its adaptability and precision. "We'd want you to start as a strategic partner," Dr. Kim explained. "Full equity stake, complete autonomy over your division, and the resources to build whatever you think the market needs next." I told her I needed time to consider the offer, but in reality, I'd already decided. The only question was timing. That evening, I sat in my apartment reviewing the intellectual property documentation my lawyer had prepared months earlier. Every algorithm, every predictive model, every piece of strategic methodology I'd developed over 8 years at Lockridge, it was all mine. I'd been careful to develop everything using my own resources, my own time, my own insights. Tomorrow, I would give Vanguard my answer. But first, I had a gala to attend. The morning after the gala arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that follows a perfect storm. I woke at 6:30, made coffee with the same methodical precision I'd used for 8 years, and opened my laptop to compose a single email that would change everything. "Dr. Kim," I typed, "I'm pleased to accept Vanguard's offer. I can start as early as next Monday." By the time I sent that message, the first tremors were already beginning at Lockridge Partners. I'd designed my resignation to be surgical in its precision. The letter itself was professionally cordial, thanking Bradley for his mentorship, expressing gratitude for the opportunities I'd been given, wishing the company continued success. Standard corporate farewell boilerplate that revealed nothing about what was really happening. But attached to that resignation was something else entirely. A comprehensive intellectual property withdrawal notice, prepared by the best corporate attorney my Integra Pro revenue could afford. The document was 37 pages of legal precision, but the core message was devastatingly simple. Every predictive model, every analytical framework, every piece of strategic methodology that had made Lockridge Partners competitive in the consulting market belonged to me. Not to the company that had employed me, not to the supervisors who had taken credit for my work, but to me personally. I'd spent 8 years building their competitive advantage, and now I was taking it with me. The phone started ringing at 8:15. Bradley's assistant, probably calling to schedule some kind of damage control meeting. I let it go to voicemail. Then Bradley himself called, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Hannah, we need to talk. This intellectual property claim, there's obviously been some misunderstanding. You developed those systems as part of your employment with us." I waited until he finished before responding. "Bradley, I developed those systems using my own equipment, my own time, and my own proprietary algorithms. I never signed any IP agreements with Lockridge because, as you reminded me repeatedly, I was just technical support." "That's not, we can work this out. Don't do anything hasty." "I'm not doing anything hasty. I've been planning this for months." The silence that followed was almost satisfying. Almost. While Bradley was processing the magnitude of his situation, I was across town in Vanguard's gleaming offices, signing partnership agreements and discussing the integration of Integra Pro into their consulting platform. The contrast was jarring, where Lockridge's offices felt like a museum of 1990s corporate culture. Vanguard's space was all clean lines and collaborative workspaces, walls covered with whiteboards full of algorithmic equations rather than inspirational posters about teamwork. By noon, the press release was ready. Vanguard Insights announces strategic partnership with Hannah Mitchell, former Lockridge Partners director. The announcement detailed my role as strategic partner and the revolutionary predictive analytics platform I'd be bringing to their clients. Industry publications would run it by end of day. But the real chaos was just beginning at Lockridge. I'd built their predictive systems to be elegant and powerful, but I'd also built them to be completely dependent on my ongoing maintenance and development. Every major client engagement relied on models that required weekly calibration, algorithm updates, and custom modifications based on changing market conditions. The code was mine. The methodologies were mine, and the institutional knowledge of how everything worked together existed almost entirely in my head. The first sign of trouble came during their Tuesday morning client review meeting. The Henderson Group, a major pharmaceutical client, had requested an updated market penetration analysis for their new diabetes medication, the kind of routine request that I'd handled hundreds of times before, usually delivered within 48 hours. Ellie, now senior strategic advisor, confidently assured them it would be ready by Thursday. She probably assumed she could just modify one of my existing templates. Maybe ask one of the junior analysts to update the data inputs. But the templates weren't just spreadsheets with pretty charts. They were sophisticated analytical engines that required constant fine-tuning, custom algorithm adjustments, and deep understanding of how different variables interacted across multiple market scenarios. Without access to my underlying code and methodology, they were just empty shells. By Thursday afternoon, Ellie was calling me directly. "Hannah, I know you're moving on, but we're having some technical difficulties with the Henderson analysis. Could you walk me through your process real quick? Just this once?" "I'm sorry, Ellie, but I'm no longer a Lockridge employee. You'll need to develop your own methodologies." "But the client is expecting analysis that I developed using my proprietary systems that are no longer available to Lockridge partners." The panic in her voice was almost audible. "We could bring you back as a contractor, just for this project." "I don't think that would be appropriate. I'm sure you'll figure something out." I hung up and returned to my work at Vanguard, where I was spending the afternoon customizing Integra Pro for a Fortune 500 client who understood exactly what they were paying for. By Friday, the situation at Lockridge had escalated beyond individual client problems. Their entire project management system had been built around my predictive frameworks. Without access to my models, they couldn't accurately assess project timelines, resource requirements, or risk factors. Teams were working blind, making decisions based on intuition and outdated methodologies that had been abandoned years ago. The junior analysts were calling me constantly, their voices strained with desperation. "Hannah, the Morrison Industries project is falling apart. We can't figure out how to run the supply chain optimization model. Could you just give us a hint?" "I'm sorry, but those models are proprietary. You'll need to develop your own approaches." "But we don't know how. You never documented any of this." "I documented everything. The documentation is part of my intellectual property portfolio." The beautiful irony was that I tried to document everything, tried to train other people on my methodologies, tried to build redundancy into their systems. But Bradley had always discouraged such efforts, worried that making me replaceable would reduce his ability to take credit for my work. Now they were learning what irreplaceable actually meant. By the end of the week, 3 major clients had complained about delayed deliverables. 2 project teams were completely stalled, unable to move forward without access to my predictive models. The junior staff was working overtime to recreate basic analytical frameworks that I'd perfected years ago. And Bradley was finally beginning to understand that his technical support had been the engine driving everything he'd built his reputation on. The phone calls became more frequent, more desperate, offers to discuss my return, promises of better recognition, veiled threats about contractual obligations that didn't exist. But I was already 3 days into my new life at Vanguard, working with clients who valued innovation over politics, building systems that would reshape how strategic consulting actually worked. Behind me, Lockridge Partners was discovering what happened when you mistake the foundation for the decoration. The collapse wasn't immediate. It was a slow-motion avalanche that gathered momentum with each passing day. By the end of my second week at Vanguard, the industry gossip network was buzzing with whispers about Lockridge Partners' sudden inability to deliver on basic client commitments. The Henderson Group pharmaceutical analysis, which should have been routine, had turned into a disaster. Without access to my predictive models, the team had cobbled together a report using outdated statistical methods and generic market research. The client's response was swift and brutal. They terminated their contract immediately and demanded a full refund of their retainer. They gave us a PowerPoint presentation that looked like something from 2010. Dr. Martinez from Henderson later told me, during a casual conversation at an industry conference, charts with no underlying methodology, conclusions that contradicted basic market data, recommendations that ignored obvious risk factors. It was embarrassing. But Henderson was just the beginning. The Morrison Industries Supply Chain Optimization Project, a $3.2 million engagement that should have been Lockridge's showcase for the quarter, was hemorrhaging credibility. The client had hired them specifically because of their reputation for sophisticated predictive analytics, the kind of cutting-edge analysis that could identify inefficiencies invisible to traditional consulting approaches. Instead, they were getting Excel spreadsheets with basic pivot tables and recommendations that any junior consultant could have generated with a week of research. Morrison's CFO called it expensive common sense wrapped in consulting jargon. The junior analysts were drowning. Jessica Martinez, who'd been my most promising mentee, called me on a Thursday afternoon, her voice tight with frustration. "Hannah, I've been trying to recreate your customer lifetime value model for the Riverside Bank project. I've got the basic formula, but I can't figure out how you weighted the behavioral prediction variables. The numbers don't make sense." That's because the model uses machine learning algorithms to continuously adjust the weighting based on real-time data inputs, I explained patiently. "You can't recreate it with standard statistical methods." "But how am I supposed to?" "You're supposed to develop your own methodology. That's what consultants do." The silence stretched between us. Jessica was brilliant, but she'd been trained to implement my systems, not to innovate. None of them had been encouraged to think beyond the frameworks I'd built. "They're talking about bringing in outside consultants to help us rebuild the analytical capabilities," she said finally. "Consultants to help the consultants. It's insane." It was worse than insane. It was expensive. I'd heard through mutual contacts that Lockridge was hemorrhaging money trying to replace what I'd built. They'd hired a team of data scientists from a boutique analytics firm, paying premium rates for work that I'd been doing as part of my regular salary. The irony was delicious. Meanwhile, Ellie was struggling to maintain the facade of competence that had gotten her promoted. She'd scheduled a series of team collaboration sessions designed to harness our collective analytical intelligence. The sessions were nothing more than brainstorming meetings where she hoped someone would magically recreate years of my specialized development work. "Let's think outside the box," she'd say. According to Jessica's reports, what innovative approaches could we use to predict market volatility? The problem was that innovative approaches required innovation, and Ellie had spent her career repackaging other people's insights, not creating original solutions. She was a translator, not a creator. And now she was being asked to speak a language she'd never actually learned. The motivational quotes started appearing on her office walls around week 3. "Success is 10% inspiration, 90% perspiration. The best way to predict the future is to create it." Innovation distinguishes between a leader and a follower. Empty platitudes that highlighted exactly how empty their situation had become. The client complaints escalated rapidly. Riverside Bank's executives were questioning whether Lockridge could deliver on their contracted risk assessment analysis. Sterling Manufacturing had put their project on hold pending a review of deliverables. 3 potential new clients had withdrawn from preliminary discussions after asking pointed questions about the firm's analytical capabilities. But the most damaging blow came from an unexpected source: former clients who'd started comparing notes. Companies that had worked with Lockridge when I was there began sharing stories about the dramatic difference in quality between their past and present experiences. "It's like they've lost their secret sauce," one CEO told a trade publication reporter. "The insights used to be surgical, precise, almost prescient. Now they're giving us the same generic advice we could get from any mid-tier consulting firm." The secret sauce. If only they knew how accurate that description was. By the end of month 1, Lockridge's revenue pipeline was drying up. Word was spreading through the industry that something fundamental had changed at the firm. The sophisticated analytical capabilities that had set them apart were gone, replaced by conventional consulting approaches that dozens of other firms could provide more efficiently. Bradley was calling me daily now, his voice increasingly strained. The confident condescension had been replaced by barely controlled desperation. Hannah, we need to talk about a consulting arrangement, just temporary, until we can transition to new systems. I'm not available for consulting. I'm building something new. Name your price, whatever you want. It's not about price, Bradley. It's about the fact that you spent 8 years treating me like technical support while I built your entire competitive advantage. You can't just hire that back. The partners were beginning to panic. According to industry sources, they'd called an emergency board meeting to discuss the firm's strategic direction. The phrase existential crisis was being whispered in the hallways. Meanwhile, at Vanguard, I was thriving. The Integra Pro platform was generating client results that exceeded even my optimistic projections. Companies were seeing 20 to 30% improvements in resource allocation efficiency, and word was spreading rapidly through the tight-knit world of strategic consulting. The contrast was stark. While Lockridge was struggling to recreate basic analytical capabilities, I was pushing the boundaries of what predictive modeling could achieve. While they were losing clients, I was being approached by Fortune 500 companies who wanted access to truly innovative strategic analysis. The phone calls from former colleagues became more frequent, more desperate. Junior analysts asking for career advice, senior staff hinting at their availability for new opportunities. And through it all, the growing realization that they'd been working for a company whose entire reputation had been built on the work of someone they'd systematically undervalued. You were the whole operation, Jessica told me during one of our conversations. We just didn't realize it until you were gone. The recognition felt good, but it was 8 years too late. I was already building something better. The call came on a Friday morning, 6 weeks after I'd walked out of the Meridian Ballroom with Bradley's stunned expression burned into my memory. I was in Vanguard's conference room, reviewing quarterly projections with Dr. Kim, when my phone buzzed with a text that made me smile despite myself. Hannah, I need to see you. Please. This is Bradley. Not Bradley Quinn, or your former supervisor, just Bradley. The formality had been stripped away, leaving only desperation. I waited until Monday to respond. I'm available Thursday at 2 p.m., the Rittenhouse Hotel, lobby bar, neutral territory, public space, and expensive enough that he'd feel the weight of what this conversation was costing him. He was already there when I arrived, slouched in a leather chair that seemed to dwarf his diminished presence. Bradley had always been a commanding figure, tall, silver-haired, the kind of executive presence that clients found reassuring. Now he looked like a man who hadn't slept properly in weeks. Hannah. He stood as I approached, extending his hand in a gesture that felt more like a plea than a greeting. Thank you for coming. I settled into the chair across from him, noting the circles under his eyes, the way his usually perfect suits seemed to hang loose on his frame. You look tired, Bradley. We're hemorrhaging clients. He didn't bother with small talk or corporate pleasantries. Henderson, Morrison, Riverside, they're all gone. Sterling is reviewing their contract. 3 other major clients have requested meetings to discuss concerns about service quality. I'm sorry to hear that. No, you're not. His laugh was bitter. And you shouldn't be. We did this to ourselves. The admission hung between us like a confession. I'd expected him to negotiate, to minimize, to find some way to make this my fault. Instead, he was facing the truth with the kind of brutal honesty that comes only when all other options have been exhausted. The partners want to buy your systems, he continued. Whatever you built, Integra Pro, the predictive models, all of it, name your price. My systems aren't for sale. Then license them. We'll pay licensing fees, royalties, whatever structure you want. We just need access to something that works. I studied his face, seeing the desperation he was trying to hide. You mean you need access to something that can save your reputation? Yes. The word came out like a deflation. Yes, that's exactly what I mean. The server appeared, and I ordered coffee while Bradley nursed what looked like his 3rd scotch of the afternoon. The silence stretched between us, filled with the quiet conversations of other hotel guests conducting their own business negotiations. "Do you know what the worst part is?" Bradley asked finally. "It's not the lost revenue or the client complaints. It's realizing that for 8 years, I was taking credit for work I didn't understand well enough to recognize its value. You recognized its value. You just didn't recognize who was creating it. I thought you were just executing my vision, implementing the strategic frameworks I'd developed." He shook his head. "I convinced myself that the insights were collaborative, that your technical skills were just one component of a larger process. And now I understand that you weren't implementing my vision. You were creating the vision and letting me present it as my own." The coffee arrived, and I took a sip while considering how to respond. Part of me wanted to let him suffer, to make him articulate exactly how wrong he'd been about everything. But there was something almost pitiable about his complete capitulation. "The partners are pressuring me to find a solution," he continued. "They're talking about bringing in outside consultants to rebuild our analytical capabilities. Do you know how expensive that would be? How long it would take?" "I imagine it would be very expensive and take quite a while. 2 years minimum, according to the estimates we've received. 2 years and probably $15 million just to get back to where we were when you left." I set down my coffee cup with deliberate precision. "Bradley, let me ask you something. If I were to consider licensing my systems to Lockridge, what would that arrangement look like?" His eyes lit up with the first hope I'd seen since I'd arrived. "Whatever you want. Full licensing fees, revenue sharing, consulting rates. I'm not talking about money." The hope dimmed slightly. "Then what?" "I'm talking about recognition, public acknowledgement of who actually created the systems that made Lockridge competitive, official credit for the work that built your reputation." He was quiet for a long moment, processing what I was asking. In the corporate world, credit was currency. Admitting that your firm's competitive advantage had been built by someone else, someone you'd systematically undervalued, was professional suicide. "The partners would never agree to that," he said finally. "Then you don't really want my help." "Hannah, be reasonable. You're asking me to humiliate myself publicly, to admit that I've been taking credit for work I didn't do. I'm asking you to tell the truth. The truth would destroy my career." "Your career is already destroyed, Bradley. You're just deciding whether to go down with dignity or keep pretending that what's left of Lockridge Partners is worth saving." He finished his scotch in one gulp, then signaled the server for another. "What exactly are you proposing?" "Full public acknowledgement that Hannah Mitchell was the primary architect of Lockridge's analytical capabilities. Press releases, trade publication interviews, client communications, all of it. You credit me as the creator of every system, every model, every strategic framework that made your firm competitive. And in exchange, limited licensing agreement. You get access to basic versions of my systems, enough to fulfill existing contracts and maintain some credibility. Nothing cutting edge, nothing that would compete with what I'm building at Vanguard." How limited. Think of it as life support, not a cure. You'd be able to function, but you'd never be innovative again. You'd never be leaders in the field again. He was quiet for several minutes, staring into his fresh drink as if it might contain answers. Around us, the hotel bar hummed with quiet conversation and the clink of glasses, the sound of business being conducted by people who still had something to negotiate with. "I need to discuss this with the partners," he said finally. "Of course you do." "How long do I have?" "As long as you need." "But Bradley?" I stood, gathering my purse and coat. "Every day you wait, more clients are going to realize that the Lockridge Partners they hired doesn't exist anymore. At some point, there won't be anything left to save." I left him sitting there, staring into his scotch and contemplating the complete destruction of everything he'd built his identity around. Outside, Philadelphia's afternoon traffic moved in predictable patterns, following rules that made sense, systems that worked because they'd been designed by people who understood what they were building. Unlike the fiction Bradley had been living for 8 years, the second meeting happened 3 weeks later, this time in a private dining room at the Union League. Bradley's choice, though I suspected he'd selected it more for the soundproofing than the prestige. Some conversations were too damaging to risk in public spaces. He looked worse than before, if that was possible. The confident executive I'd known for 8 years had been replaced by someone who moved like he was carrying invisible weight. When he stood to greet me, his handshake was limp, defeated. "The partners have reviewed your proposal," he said once we were seated, his voice barely above a whisper despite the room's privacy. "And they're resistant to the public acknowledgement component." He cleared his throat. "They feel it would damage the firm's reputation irreparably." I leaned back in my chair, studying his face. "Their reputation is already damaged irreparably, Bradley. The question is whether they want to control the narrative or let it control them. They've asked me to negotiate alternative terms, perhaps a private acknowledgement, internal recognition of your contributions." "No." The word hung in the air between us like a blade. Bradley's shoulders sagged slightly, as if he'd expected this response but hoped against it. "Hannah, please. You have to understand the position this puts us in. If we publicly admit that our entire competitive advantage was built by one person who you systematically undervalued and ultimately drove away." I corrected. "Don't sanitize it, Bradley. Own what you did." He was quiet for a moment, then pulled out his phone and showed me a series of emails. "Look at this. These are just from this week." I scrolled through message after message. Client complaints, contract cancellations, project delays. Riverside Bank had terminated their engagement entirely. Sterling Manufacturing was demanding a 50% refund on their retainer. 3 other major clients had put their projects on hold pending quality assurance reviews. Morrison Industries is threatening to sue us for breach of contract, Bradley continued. "They're claiming we misrepresented our capabilities when we pitched them. The legal costs alone could bankrupt us." "I'm sorry to hear that." "No, you're not." He laughed bitterly. "And honestly, I wouldn't be either, if I were you. But Hannah, there are 43 people working at Lockridge, junior analysts, support staff, people who had nothing to do with how you were treated. They're going to lose their jobs if this continues." It was a masterful guilt trip, and under different circumstances, it might have worked. But I'd spent too many years watching those same people benefit from my work while I remained invisible to feel responsible for their situation now. "Those 43 people will find other jobs," I said calmly. "Most of them are talented enough to be hired anywhere. The question is whether you want to give them 3 months to find new positions gracefully, or whether you want to let the firm collapse catastrophically and make them all unemployed simultaneously." Bradley's phone buzzed with another message. He glanced at it, and his face went pale. "What is it?" "Henderson Industries just recommended that their industry association drop us from their preferred vendor list." He set the phone down with shaking hands. "That's 12 potential clients who won't even consider us for future projects." The waiter appeared with our lunch orders, but neither of us touched the food. Bradley poured himself a glass of wine with unsteady hands. "What would the public acknowledgement look like?" he asked finally. "Press release to all major trade publications, statement on your website, direct communication to all current and former clients, full attribution of the analytical frameworks, predictive models, and strategic methodologies that made Lockridge competitive." "And you want me to personally sign off on this?" "I want you to personally deliver it. Interviews, conference presentations, industry panels, all of it. You're going to stand up in front of your peers and explain exactly how the firm's success was built and who built it." The color drained from his face. "That would be career suicide." "Bradley, your career is already dead. You're just deciding whether to have a funeral or let it rot in the street." He stared at his untouched salmon, then looked up at me with something that might have been respect. "You really want to destroy me, don't you?" "I don't want to destroy you. I want you to tell the truth. There's a difference." "Is there?" "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like the same outcome." I considered this for a moment. "Maybe. But the truth is that you spend 8 years building a reputation on work you didn't do, taking credit for innovations you didn't create, and promoting people who were better at politics than problem solving. The truth is that when the person who actually generated your competitive advantage left, you discovered that you had no idea how to maintain what you'd been selling. And now? Now you have a choice. You can admit what really happened, give credit where it's due, and salvage what's left of your firm with some dignity intact. Or you can keep pretending that this is all some temporary setback that you'll overcome with teamwork and positive thinking. Bradley reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder. I've had our lawyers draft a licensing agreement based on your terms. Limited access to your systems. Enough to fulfill existing contracts and maintain basic functionality. I reviewed the document quickly. It was professionally written, but toothless, full of escape clauses and limitations that would allow them to minimize their obligations while maximizing their benefits. This isn't what I proposed, I said, sliding the folder back across the table. It's what we can offer. Then we don't have a deal. I stood to leave, but Bradley's voice stopped me. Hannah, wait, please. I remained standing, my purse over my shoulder, coat in hand. What? If I do this, if I publicly acknowledge your contributions, give you full credit for everything, what happens to me? I don't know, Bradley, that's not my concern. It used to be. We used to be colleagues, friends even. Doesn't that count for something? I looked at him sitting there, diminished and desperate, and felt something that might have been pity. We were never friends, Bradley. Friends don't take credit for each other's work. Friends don't promote other people's intellectual property as their own insights. Friends don't spend 8 years systematically undervaluing someone's contributions. But if I do what you are asking, if you do what I'm asking, you'll be telling the truth for the first time in 8 years. What happens after that is up to you. I left him sitting there with his untouched lunch and his impossible choice, walking out into the Philadelphia afternoon with the satisfaction of someone who'd finally stopped playing by rules designed to ensure she could never win. Behind me, Bradley was learning what accountability actually cost. The email arrived on a Thursday morning, 2 weeks after our final meeting. The subject line was simple. Statement for review, B. Quinn. I opened it to find a draft press release that exceeded even my expectations. Bradley hadn't just met my requirements, he'd embraced them with the thoroughness of someone who'd decided that half measures were more painful than complete honesty. Lockridge Partners acknowledges foundational contributions of Hannah Mitchell. The headline read, What followed was 3 pages of detailed attribution, crediting me as the primary architect of every analytical framework, predictive model, and strategic methodology that had made the firm competitive over the past 8 years. But the real surprise came in the final paragraph. I personally failed to recognize and properly credit Ms. Mitchell's extraordinary contributions during her tenure with our firm. This oversight represents a fundamental failure of leadership on my part and a disservice to someone whose work was instrumental in our success. It was signed by Bradley Quinn, managing partner. The press release went live the following Monday. By noon, my phone was ringing constantly. Trade publication reporters, former clients, industry colleagues who'd heard rumors but never understood the full scope of what had happened. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Hannah Mitchell, the hidden architect behind Lockridge's success, ran in consulting today within 48 hours. Business Analytics Weekly followed with The Consultant Behind the Consultants, How One Woman Built an Industry Leader. Forbes picked up the story with Strategic Consulting's Best-Kept Secret Reveals Herself. But the most satisfying response came from former clients. Email after email from CEOs and executives who'd worked with Lockridge during my tenure, all expressing the same sentiment. They'd known someone extraordinary was behind the analysis, and now they finally understood who. Your work saved our company during the 2022 market downturn, wrote the CEO of Morrison Industries. We've been trying to recreate those insights ever since. Would you consider a direct engagement? The client inquiries were constant. Companies that had ended their relationships with Lockridge wanted to work directly with me. Organizations that had never heard of Lockridge Partners were reaching out based on the coverage alone. Within a month, Vanguard's client roster had doubled, and I was fielding more requests than I could handle. Meanwhile, Lockridge Partners was experiencing what could only be described as a controlled demolition. The public acknowledgement had given them some credibility with existing clients, enough to fulfill current contracts without legal complications. But the revelation had also made it clear that their golden age was over. 3 junior analysts reached out to me about opportunities at Vanguard. 2 senior consultants were quietly circulating resumes. Even Ellie sent a LinkedIn message expressing interest in exploring new opportunities in data-driven consulting. Bradley, to his credit, handled the aftermath with more grace than I'd expected. He gave interviews to several publications, expanding on the press release with detailed explanations of how my work had shaped the firm's trajectory. He spoke at an industry conference about the importance of recognizing technical contributions in consulting environments. I spent 8 years thinking I was the strategist and she was the implementer. He told a room full of managing partners. I was wrong. She was the strategist, the implementer, and the innovator. I was just the person who happened to be in charge. The speech went viral in consulting circles. Bradley Quinn became an inadvertent poster child for leadership accountability, though I suspected his career would never recover from the honesty. 6 months later, I received a final message from him. Lockridge Partners has been acquired by Davidson & Associates. I'm retiring from consulting. Thank you for forcing me to tell the truth. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, and the most important. I never responded. There was nothing left to say. Today, Integra Pro powers strategic decisions for Fortune 500 companies across 12 industries. Vanguard Insights has become the fastest-growing consulting firm in the Northeast, and I've been promoted to Chief Strategy Officer with full equity partnership. The predictive models I developed are now taught in MBA programs as case studies in innovative business analytics. But the real victory wasn't professional. It was personal. For the first time in my career, I was working in an environment where intelligence was valued over politics, where innovation was rewarded over conformity, where the person who did the work got the credit for doing it. The industry had finally learned my name. More importantly, I'd learned what I was worth. Sometimes the best revenge isn't destruction, it's simply refusing to be invisible anymore. Thank you for listening to this story of workplace justice and personal triumph. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment below letting me know what city or country you're listening from so we can connect with our global community. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts about workplace dynamics, recognition, and standing up for your worth. Your engagement helps these stories reach others who might need to hear them.